Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz, and I'm the store's event coordinator. Community Bookstore is celebrating over 50 years in business, and we credit the continued support of readers and writers for this milestone. So thank you for spending the evening with us. I'm thrilled today to be collaborating once again with our friends at New York Review Books to welcome David Shields for a discussion of his newest book, The Very Last Interview, in conversation with Laura Kipnis. Now to some housekeeping before I introduce our guests. We've enabled Zoom's auto transcribe setting. So if your version of Zoom is up to date, hit the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, please click on the Q&A button, which is also at the bottom of your screen, to submit them. We will be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat box through which I will be posting a link to buy tonight's book if you haven't already. And one caveat for tonight is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We'll try to resolve them quickly. We have a great lineup of events planned for you this spring, so do head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to point out in particular is on Thursday, April 14th, we'll be back with NYRB to welcome Daniel Mendelsohn for the paperback launch of his memoir, Three Rings, in conversation with Garth Greenwell. That program is up on our website now and taking registrations. So now, a little about tonight's guests and we'll get started. David Shields is the internationally best-selling author of more than 20 books, including Reality Hunger, The Thing About Life Is That One Day You'll Be Dead, Black Planet, Other People, Takes and Mistakes, Nobody Hates Trump More Than Trump, An Intervention, and Trouble with Men, Reflections on Sex, Love, Marriage, Porn, and Power. Shields is a recipient of Guggenheim and NEA fellowships, a senior contributing writer of Conjunctions, and the Lauren Douglas Milliman Distinguished Writer in Residence at the University of Washington in Seattle. And Laura Kipnis is the author of Love in the Time of Contagion, A Diagnosis. Her previous books include Unwanted Advances, Sexual Paranoia Comes to Campus, and Against Love, A Polemic. So now without any further ado, I will leave the screen to you two. David, Laura, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you. So I guess I'm going to start. David and I agreed. I want to ask a kind of wide-ranging question that you can answer in any way you choose, obviously. But I mean, I should say, since we haven't exactly had an intro to the book, that the book is written in the form of an extended interview. It's a set of interview questions, presumably asked to you by interviewers, but organized into sections. But the entire book is in the form of questions. So in some ways, that's like what you hear this, people use this term these days, like committing to a bit, so you've committed to a bit, which is in a sense a form, or it is a form, and it's a form that has this, kind of rigidity to it. It's set in advance. But what I wanted to talk about and then ask you about is the way that my experience of reading the book kept changing. And, like you think you know what you're getting into, and then it keeps like mutating, it kept becoming a kind of different book as I was reading it. And so I wanted to describe a little bit like my experience of reading it and the different kind of shifts of the book, because my sense of what you were doing and what you're up to kind of kept changing as I was reading it. So, like at first, it's a very funny book, I should say. So, I mean, at first it's very hilarious in the way that it's mocking the interview process and the kind of pomposity of these extraordinarily huge unanswerable questions, like how large a part does insecurity play in our culture, that sort of thing, like,
right.
Which kind of the familiar unanswerable question.
Right.
So, but as I, and it's funny. So as I was reading on, I thought, oh, actually what the subject of this book or the subtext of the book is passive aggressiveness. That like behind every question was this agenda, or was a kind of veiled form of put down.
Right.
And I thought, oh, that's so brilliant, that like every question has this agenda. There are no innocent questions. And it's this sort of maybe a bit of a paranoid worldview, but not like necessarily a wrong worldview. So that was my first take, was that it was all about passive aggressiveness. And then as I read on, I mean, the questions also become far more blatantly aggressive, so it's much more about aggression and the aggressive situation of the interview and the interviewer's competition and the interviewer's careerism. And, so then there's like a lot of naked aggression that comes out, which is kind of chilling because it's also maybe in some ways about the price or consequences or situation of having some literary fame, that there's always a kind of knife out to get you. But then as I was reading on, it kind of seemed to me that what I was reading was not just this dyadic situation of an interviewer and an interviewee, but something more like the culture, like addressing you and your career. And there was a kind of protracted rebuke for the kinds of experimentations that you've done. And, but it seemed like, it was a referendum on both your career and you as a person, but that there was this like collectivity doing this, like, interview or interrogation of you and intent on like correcting your faults. And there was a kind of aim to humiliate. Mm-hmm. So, and then like, as it went on, and I mean, it's not quite so like successive as I'm saying, but I mean, finally in the end, it seemed to me that the dialogue was very much like this inner dialogue with a superego that you have at 4 a.m. and the superego demanding to know why you've wasted your life and why you're incapable of loving and why you're, a terrible husband or person, or, you're a failure. And what does your career amounted to? Nothing. You don't know how to have fun. There's a kind of theme throughout that you've missed out on something, that, there's something you don't know about how to live. And then I will just say one last thing about the experience that occurs periodically in the reading, which is that occasionally there just are these kind of like heartbreaking moments of empathy, like a question comes at you that's just very sad. Like one example on page 64, have you ever looked for a long time into your own eyes in the mirror and seen how full of sadness they are? So like in the midst of this, harangue, like these occasional moments of like connection and empathy or something.
Right.
So that's kind of like, that was my experience of reading
right.
it.
I mean, obviously I'm thrilled by your engagement with them. It always seems to me the highest praise I offer a book is that, the work keeps on changing. It keeps changing gears, and that it, keeps on mutating. So if the book had some of that quality to you, that's obviously very gratifying to hear. I mean, I just think, if once you settle into a book as this static thing, I'm usually quite bored. And so the way the book kept on flipping for you, as you say, it's not a success of the movement. It's not like the first 14 pages are this and the next 14 are that, but the way you kept on redefining the frame of the book is really lovely to me. And I think it went through all those mutations for me writing it, and it still is changing for me what I think it is. I mean, I think I'll very briefly talk about how I came to write it, and then I'll do a very brief reading from it.
Good.
Just so people have a sense of it. I think the pub date is April 12th, so very few people in the audience have it, maybe a few reviewers or whatever, but anyway, thank you, Laura, for engaging so beautifully with it. I mean, that's so characteristic of you. And so, I very briefly, because I think the process interests me, that, I was trying to think of what book to do next. And in my odd sort of, I don't know what you call it, antic, playful, experimental, self-deconstructive way, I thought, I'll try to find every interview I've ever been guilty of committing, not interviews I've done. I mean, I've done, a dozen or so interviews as a journalist of various figures. And I think I probably found those as well. But essentially, I've been publishing books for 35 or more years. And so every time you publish a book, you are asked to be interviewed for more or fewer times. And so I either found the interviews as tape or audio or transcript or whatever, and I just simply gathered them. And I realized I wasn't interested in the answers at all. I'd been pontificating on these themes for an awful lot of times, whether books like Reality Hunger, How Literature Saved My Life, etc. So all my answers just bored me terribly, but the questions interest me. I think I found 2,700 questions I'd been asked over almost 40 years. I think that my first book, a novel, was published in 84. So that's what, 38 years ago, which is a weird idea. And so I got interested in those questions, as you say, the passive aggression of them, the need to undermine, sometimes the insight, the empathy, the intelligence. And also, I just have always loved the, as you say, the sort of dyad between interviewer and interviewee. I've always loved those books, whether it's, that film script Cormac McCarthy wrote in which someone tries to talk somebody out of suicide, or I like Philip Roth's novel Deception. I like Paget Powell's book of Q&A. I mean, I've always loved that ancient form, going all the way up through, say, car talk, of just two people engaged. And so anyway, I got interested in the questions, and then I got interested in them as thematized categories, like, I think the one I'm going to read tonight is called Speech, how I had a childhood stutter and still have glimmers of it. And so I pushed all the questions into broad thematic categories, 22 short chapters. And then, as I say, I think it's on the flap of the book, I then remade the questions and rewrote them and decontextualized and recontextualized them. And to me, I would even push your point a little farther, Laura, and say, in some ways, I don't know if you agree, but there's a sense in which the interviewer, I think, is almost trying to get the interviewee to commit suicide. There's a real escalating narrative. And there's even a short film version of the book, which you can see on Vimeo. The film director, Nick Toddy, and his wife, Rachel Kempf, made the book into a 30-minute film, which I really like. And it really pushes that idea. So there's not only a desire to undermine, but there's something very aggressive about all kinds of interviewing, as we all know. I guess it's a version of the Didion line, the writer's always selling someone out, and that I think there's such hostility built into that process. So I think I've been chatting enough. Perhaps I'll take a brief, I've been instructed to flash the book. So here's this beautiful Richard Diebenkorn cover, which looks a little scarily like me, I think, but that wasn't the reason that I chose it. I just thought it was a gorgeous cover. So anyway, thanks to NYRB for this really beautifully produced book. So it's really short, but it has very generous margins and large type. So it's a 150-page book, but it's a very, very brief book. So probably only around 20,000 words. So buy many copies. Anyway, I'm going to read this book, this chapter called Speech. The book is divided up into all kinds of little sections, which sort of are a Bildungsroman or a growing up novel. It kind of takes some version of me from childhood all the way toward, questions of suicide and what's next and what has one's life come to. But anyway, I'll read a short section. If you happen to have a copy of the book, it's pages 28 through 32 of your hymnal. So Speech is, so it has a short epigraph. All the chapters have brief epigraphs from lofty sources. This is from Joseph Conrad. Are not our lives too short for that full utterance, which through all our stammerings is of course our only and abiding intention? So how badly did you stutter as a child? Did you ever get to a point where you just wanted to throw up your hands and stop talking? stop writing because language is the enemy, etc. And then as you got older, of course, apparently yearn at times to stop existing. Would you have become a writer if you didn't stutter? Is stuttering perhaps the best thing to ever happen to you? Now, are stuttering and stammering different? Is it genetic? Did either of your parents stutter? Or is it psychological, mental, psychosomatic, environmental? Fill me in, I have no idea. How did your family treat your impediment? Was it worse for you when talking to girls? Worse with pretty girls? Worse with adults? Worse still with authority figures? Do you struggle particularly with consonants or vowels? So the quote, problem sounds migrate over time? Right, like how many different words do Eskimos have for snow? What did you think of Michael Palin in A Fish Called Wanda? In real life, as you may know, his father stuttered. How about Billy Bibbit in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Billy Budd, Anthony Blanche in Brideshead Revisited. What are the other key stutter texts? Is there a pattern then to how it gets portrayed? You remind me a bit of the boy who couldn't swim, but who jumps into the deep end of the pool to learn how. When your novel about stuttering was published, you went out and gave readings and did interviews. How did you conquer or at least manage your fear? There's only the slightest hint of a stutter when I listen to you now. Have you truly overcome it? Circumlocution, that's the technical term. What do you want the rest of us to comprehend about this baffling disorder? Humans are the only animals who use spoken language to communicate. Without it, are we the elephant man? Writing then as revenge upon stuttering. How so? Many writers are or were stutterers. Edward Hoagland, John Updike, Elizabeth Bowen, Somerset Maugham, David Mitchell, Arnold Bennett, Lewis Carroll, Margaret Drabble, Bud Schulberg, Peter Straub, Neville Shute, Kenneth Tynan, Mikado de Assis. What do you see as the through line here? Aggressively minor? Interesting. Writing fluently about disfluency. How cathartic that must have been, I'm guessing. You've written about how stutterers in literature and in film and in life often get away with certain rudenesses, certain violations that they wouldn't have gotten away with if they didn't stutter. What did you get away with? Do you still? Can I hear you read a little from the book? How about the long paragraph at the end of chapter 5 in which, quote, stutterers are the only truth tellers. Everyone else is lying. You doing okay over there, Mr. Shields? I'm going to press pause, all right? I thought that was fine, but perhaps you could read it one more time. Don't you think we all have our own, quote, speech problem to some degree? I know I do. Do you think anyone can really understand anyone else? And if not, what are any of us doing other than walking around trapped for eternity in our own spacesuits? So what should we talk about now, Laura? You want to talk about our interest in your book and my book and the weird overlaps between them?
Well, I should want to talk about that for careerist reasons, but I just wanted to ask you something about this section, because there's another theme, I think, in this book about like the question that comes up like about vulnerability. And like, are you playing on vulnerability in some sort of, I mean, the accusation is hovering that there's like a bad faith quality to being vulnerable in public, because one profits by it. And so it's like, that's like also a theme or movement in the book, that everything that you reveal. And I want to get to, like, I also want to ask about like the truth status of stuff. I mean, since it is true that you stutter because you've demonstrated it in public, so it's not a fake revelation.
Right.
But I mean, what about that? Do you think vulnerability brings out the aggression in your audiences or in the culture?
Wow, that's a complicated dynamic. I'm trying to unpack that in a strange way, that if you're vulnerable, or if you explore your own self-punishing tendencies, which to me are pretty irreducibly human, that it can sometimes trigger in a certain sort of sadistic kind of cultural critic a desire to sort of jump on, sort of deepen the masochism. I remember a wonderful book that I admire greatly by Wayne Kostenbaum called Humiliation, I think it's called. I don't know if you know that book. I think
I reviewed it at one point.
Oh, do you did?
Or I wrote about it in my men's book. Yeah.
Oh, perhaps that's, yeah, maybe, of course. And, I think it's an interesting book, but some of the reviews, and one review in particular, took an almost, transparently sadistic delight in deepening the humiliation. I think that can and does happen. It's this thing I'm very interested in, the relationship between reviewers and writers, or the culture and people trying to create art, is that there's a way in which sometimes, the culture can use a writer's vulnerability to try to make itself well. I guess we're going to make the inevitable segue here to the Academy Awards and the moment between Chris Rock and Will Smith, in which everyone takes some easy high road of moral indignation on some level, whereas the moment is this endlessly fascinating thing, and everyone's terribly afraid of acknowledging their own complicity, their own violence, their own confusion and anger. And so there's this sort of rush toward moral purity, which is, the enemy of art. And so anyway, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, other than, I think I work in personal essay, and you more or less do as well, with perhaps larger elements of cultural criticism in the foreground of your work. But you probably get that as well, I'm sure, in reviews in which you acknowledge your own confusion, your own complexity, your own hungers and envies and needs. And you probably, I don't know, I haven't studied your reviews as carefully as I studied my own, but you've probably gotten the reviews, I guess, perhaps, in which people decry your own human flawedness. I've always have loved that wonderful line. Is it originally by Immanuel Kant, but, quoted by Isaiah Berlin, in which, nothing straight was ever made from the crooked timber of humanity, is sort of the guiding principle of my writing life, and to really explore what is the crooked timber of humanity. Nobody's straight here, as it were. And, anyone who pretends toward not having their own crookedness is really, to me, not particularly useful.
Yeah, the thing that seemed so dispiriting about the response to the slap was this demand that you feel one way about it, and that you condense that, take into whatever number of words you're allowed on Twitter these days. Is
Right.
feeling 5 different ways at once. about it. And
right.
yeah, so I mean, there's this demand, I think, now to both, you know, to be constantly issuing these cultural rebukes or these, you know, human rebukes to anybody who strays or makes a mistake, but also, you know, that it's a black or white kind of thing. So yeah, no, it is. And I think, I mean, I find it, that kind of sense that that's what the response is going to be to things makes it somewhat more difficult to write than I mean, it's always difficult to write, but I think it used to feel like the audience was kind of going to be ready to see things in multivalenced ways more so than now. Maybe. Do you feel that way?
I mean, I'm completely off social media. I mean, and I have been for a while. So I just don't, I mean, without sounding it's good or bad, I just don't have the bandwidth to do it. And so, you know, I am aware of how balkanized the conversation has become, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, I mean, this might be self-glamorizing or self-flattering toward both of us, but you know, that you and I were talking recently a little bit about your new book and how you're trying to decide what to do next, and I am too, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, that this thing interests us, and, you know, that phrase of running toward danger interests me a lot, you know, and like that great line of Auden's, you know, great art is clear thinking about mixed feelings. You know, that's sort of the heart of my writing project, is to try to think halfway decently about my own deeply mixed feelings. And so, I mean, to me, it opens up space for me to work. Like, that becomes exciting to me. If the conversations become stultified and somewhat righteous, then that becomes the very material that I'm trying to write about. And I think you too as well, I think.
Well, one thing we could talk about is, because in my last book, I was writing more personally than I have in other books, and also writing about other people. And, you know, that's one of the things in your book, like, how do you handle writing about a beloved or a, you know, person in your life or an ex? And, you know, as I said, I've kind of been a more confessional writer, and I, for the first time, was thinking a lot about that question.
Right.
Do you have thoughts that you want to?
I mean, I thought, you know, I think in terms, you know, I'll focus on you. I mean, that
and I'll turn it back to you.
Exactly. Like, I thought I wanted a little more about how love in the time of contagion was affecting your life at home with your partner, and that, you know, it was sort of fascinatingly oblique, and in a way it sort of corresponds to how in my new book, you know, this current book, The Very Last Interview, you know, there are no answers, and you have to fill in the gaps and figure out what, quote, my implied answers are. And I felt like that you kept it nicely off stage, and I felt like it kept building really nicely, but I wasn't totally clear. I guess it's implied with your acknowledgements of, you know, this book is dedicated to my cellmate or whatever. It's sort of implied that the couple, I think, stays together, but that was sort of interestingly oblique. I mean, I think it's a challenging thing that, I mean, about writing about other people. I mean, obviously it's a very difficult thing. And, you know, what's that incredible line of David Markson's that he says, I don't know if it's his line or if he is quoting, he often leaves that oblique, but the line is something like, how dare he think he could pluck a single leaf from the laurel tree of art without paying for it with his very life. I don't know if that's an ancient line or if it seems a little melodramatic to contemporary sensibilities, but I feel like I'm really am exploring that and facing that. And, you know, I don't have any easy answers for it. If you're as autobiographical a writer as I am, apparently, you know, there's that Markson quote I've always used to like to quote in theory, but I'm seeing the shrapnel of it pretty directly in my own life. I'm not sure how much more exact I want to be, but obviously if you write a book called The Trouble with Men, Reflections on Sex, Life, Marriage, Porn, and Power, like there are going to be repercussions. So, you know, I don't have any easy answers other than that kind of psychic danger is where is for me where interesting reading and writing happens. I mean, do you have a different take? Do you feel like you pulled the curtain back on life? And I mean, are there certain places you just did not want to explore? Or
Well, you use the question form to divulge various kinds of turns of events in your life and in your
Right.
personal life.
Right.
So you kind of catch us up on various family events, on the state of your marriage, via the questions. You know, so
Right.
there's this autobiographical or confessional imperative persists, you know, despite the form that you've
Right.
prescribed to yourself. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to ask you, because it did also come up in my own writing, was, you know, not feeling like I necessarily had to be literal about the confessions that I was confessing or the truths, you know, because I was talking about my relationship and coupled lockdown during the pandemic and, you know, doing, yeah, more confessing, I guess, of personal stuff that I'm used to. But one of the things, to put it back to you, David, that I came across that I thought was kind of fascinating in the questions, and it seemed to be like a kind of inside joke. So I want to laugh. I want to congratulate you on the inside joke that I came across, which is where you have a one of the interview questions is somebody saying, "Is this your phone number?" Because they're going to text you something, I guess.
Right.
And I thought, is he putting his phone number in his book? And so I actually went and looked up your phone number because I was, you know, curious about that. And it's very close to your phone number. It's just like a few numbers transposed. And I thought, oh, well, that's a kind of funny little joke about, you know, it looks like a fact, but it's kind of all switched around as a fact. And then I wondered, I mean, do you mean that to be a kind of little synecdoche or whatever you call it for your relation to truth as a whole? But then in another place in the book, somebody says something like, you know, like if there's one dash of fiction, if one fact is wrong, it would make the book a work of fiction. So, you know, then when you reveal things about, like, say that your marriage has ended, I don't know whether I should take it literally, or are you playing with us in the way that the phone number did? So
I think that's really, I mean, you've exploded that trope really nicely via the phone number. That in a lot of drafts of the book, I did have my actual telephone number, and as you can see, it's pretty close to my own phone number. Everything is just sort of moved around a bit. And then I think it was my literary agent who said, like, David, why are you putting your phone number in this book? Not that I have, you know, like, it's like that moment in The Catcher in the Rye where, you know, Holden Caulfield wants to be able to call up every writer. It's not like I have such a legion of readers. They're all going to bludgeon me with their text. But I think that is a good image of how the book actually works. I mean, in earlier versions, I called it a novel, but I think I and whatever editor agent decided that it was sort of promising maybe more narrativity than the book actually delivers. I mean, when you call it the very last interview a novel, it sounds almost like maybe, you know, it'll be, you know, some Oriana Fallaci trying to track down, you know, the Shah of
war criminal
Iran. Sorry.
A war criminal. Yeah.
Yeah, it just doesn't have that kind of drama. To me, the book does have a real plot, though, in which some version of myself, who I would argue is pretty fictionalized, poeticized. There's an immense amount of poetic liberty, but it's, you know, it does track approximately with my life. Anybody who knows me or some of my writings can see how almost chapter by chapter, it's almost name checking various books I've written or things like that. But there's plenty of poetic liberty taken. But so I think that idea of the fictionalized telephone number is a pretty good trope for how the book works. And so, and it's meant to be somewhat playful, so that it feels very autobiographical. Some people sort of think of the book as like the most confessional book I've written, the rawest, the most naked, the most almost uncomfortable, the most discomforting. But on the other hand, there's a playful element going on in which there is this sort of suicide thread. And at the end of it, it appears to be a kind of literary strategy to give the book a kind of mode or traction. So I'm not trying to be too clever. I'm only interested in postmodernism that has a distinctly human face. Like, I'm not interested in sheer trickery per se. That doesn't really interest me. But yeah, there is that line I quote of Nicholson Baker's. I think I was on a panel with him a long time ago. And yeah, I do like his work a lot, but for some reason, I'm very invested in claiming him as more of an essayist or a writer of book-length essay, whereas to him, it's important if he changes a couple of details to call a book like, say, The Mezzanine or Room Temperature, quote, novels, because he changed a few details. I don't know. And he and I argued about that a bit. But, I just, I'm very, sort of famously, Thucydides changed the general speeches in the history of the Peloponnesian War. He basically made up the general speeches. And so that was sort of this founding document of world history. And so if that founding document is essentially a false document, it tells you a lot about how, absolutely true, quote, nonfiction is. So anyway, there's a bit of that element of playful fictionalizing going on in the book. But yeah, I think in a way, the core of the book is a bit of a memento mori, that whole tradition. I'm not that old. I think that you and I are around the same age. But, maybe sort of going through pandemic, divorce, being in intensive psychoanalysis, like all that makes me feel like a bit of an older soul than I felt 3 years ago. Part of what your book deals with so admirably is just the, even if you have a relatively privileged life, the pandemic has made all of us, I think, death-filled in ways that some of us weren't beforehand. And so part of the book is being, age 65 and feeling like, okay, what, and just sort of trying to take stock of my life in some artistic, literary, spiritual way that feels to me essentially serious. So to me, I don't like some of the reviews or other people say, oh, the book is very funny. And it's like, really, it is? I don't think the book is that funny. Like, there are elements of jokes in it. There's essentially a kind of, what would you call it, snarky take on the format between an interviewer and an interviewee. But the essential push of the book is this, to me, existentially serious self-questioning that feels to me kind of sincere, although the sincerity is slightly within quotation mark.
Well, it moves very fast between those different levels. I was going to read one of my favorite questions in the book, and then we could turn it over to other people's questions. But what I really love about this particular one is this movement between the kind of like existential question and a kind of hilarity, because there is, you do have a kind of stand-up impulse also in the book.
Totally.
It really, I really did laugh out loud.
Wow, that's great. Thanks.
But okay, this is 148. If every joke is an epigraph on the death of a feeling, then your lifelong obsession with stand-up makes you what? Kind of a serial killer of feelings then? I just love that. It just made me laugh. It was so unexpected.
Thanks. You know the line, don't you?
No.
From Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, it's an incredible line. Every joke is an epigraph on the death of a feeling. Isn't that an incredible line?
Yeah.
He just got so much so right. It's incredible. But anyway,
where did the twist come from? I know what you mean. Serial killer of feelings. That was just you?
Yeah, that was me. I've always loved that Nietzsche line. And then as I started to work with it, and I think this is in, of course, the comedy section, immensely, I mean, thank you for saying that, there's something in me that's very stand-up. I'm very drawn toward writers who have a very strong ear for stand-up, which you have. I mean, you are a performance artist, right? I mean,
Video artist, yeah.
Leonard Michaels writes for the ear in that way.
Oh, and there's
And
that
then-
hilarious line about Leonard Michaels, if you remember it. I don't know where it is.
What do I talk about certain kinds of Jewish writing? Was it that part?
No, that you took a trip to Berkeley to ask him
Oh, yeah.
something, a question about.
Yeah, I was
whether-
just so influenced by his work. I traveled from Providence, Rhode Island to Berkeley to have him free me up from the effect of his voice. I could not write in any other way except in a Leonard Michaels tone. He has such an aggressive tone. And for a couple of years in college, I wrote totally these really obvious Leonard Michaels ripoffs. And I just said, please free me from your voice. And he just said, go away, young man, or something. But anyway, I mean, I think a big influence, I think I actually talked about this in the book, and then we can turn over to people weirdly questioning us in this book about questions. But I was terribly influenced as a kid. I grew up in LA and San Francisco, and in San Francisco there was this incredible show on KSFO on Saturdays from 8 a.m. until 12 noon, in which during the 60s and 70s in San Francisco, they would have a relatively open-minded view about what could be on the radio. And I would just listen to stand-up for 4 hours from 8 until, I was a very weird little kid, of course, and I would listen to, pretty good stand-up. And I had at the time just a horrific stutter. And the relationship between my stutter and these aggressive, funny, voice-driven comedians was just, to me, a crucial moment in the derivation of my literary aesthetic. So much of what I try and do on the page, isn't hilarious the way stand-up can be, but it tries to be sort of mordantly funny, line by line, in that way. And so perhaps this book is the closest that I've come to my own mini stand-up routine.
Yeah, it's because of the condensation, the compressed quality of it, which is very much like the stand-up's art, I guess.
Right.
All right, let's turn over to some questions. So I'll just start at the beginning. I'll read, I'll read a couple and you can.
Sure.
Okay. Somebody asks, is anonymous attendee, is this a sequel to The Trouble with Men? And then another question is, have you read Kristen Miller-Young's essay, How to Break Even, and how do you find it artistically speaking of culture rebuking your career? You can take those two.
Okay, the first one was, is it a response to
Trouble with Men?
Trouble with Men? I mean, not directly. I don't see it, and I'm not familiar with the other essay.
Ah, okay. Well, that's a recommendation, I guess. I think this is your editor. What question that frequently gets asked do you find the most productive or the least? From Nicholas During.
Oh, it's from Nick. What question do I find the most productive or the least productive? I mean,
I
guess
hope not ones that I asked.
Right. I mean, I think I like it. I mean, sometimes there's some very good podcasts like this. I'll just do a shout out to my friend Scott Kent Jones, who has a wonderful podcast called Give and Take, in which he really leans in with his own psychic disequilibrium. I mean, he really reads the book, he absorbs it, and he really makes it a conversation about existence rather than like, I'm going to ask you 12 questions about you and your book. And so, I mean, I feel like that we've done that relatively decently here tonight, where, you have written your own somewhat revelatory book, and we have worried these questions together as friends and colleagues. And this is, I think, the second or third time that we've done this kind of conversation. I guess the kinds of questions I find the most productive are those in which the or the other person is, equally complicit, just to strike that particular note. So I'm not sure I'm answering particularly well Nicholas's question, but the sort of ex cathedra, on high questions, I just don't find particularly productive, whereas the ones that are, sort of using the book as a launch pad to ask questions that we all share, that seems to me a much more productive stance.
I'm reminded, I don't know if you'll remember this, the first time that we met, we had lunch, and I was thinking of writing a book on narcissism, and I actually had in mind that it would be an interview with you on narcissism. I think I started asking you some questions, and I just didn't feel like it could sustain itself. But it was, I guess you do evoke in us, your audience, this desire to interrogate you or something.
I guess
Can
so.
you-
That's such a weird dynamic.
Pin you
I'll have
down
to
like a butterfly, like an.
I know. I'll have to keep thinking about that. I remember that particular lunch, and I remember, what did I do wrong? Like, was I not sufficiently narcissistic for Laura to write a book or something? I felt like I was too
Smooth.
unnarcissistic or something.
No, your answers were a little too, I don't know, not telling enough. I can't remember, but let's go on with the other people's questions. Do you think of the questioner as a version of you or another specific archetype? Or does the matter of the questioner's identity not really matter to you? I've started the book and I'm so enjoying it, but haven't read deep enough to discover if the answer to this question is contained therein. So is the questioner a version of you or another archetype? Or does it not matter?
Well, I try not to, I think what you're supposed to do as an interviewee is to be very, I'm sure that what was that wonderful Janet Malcolm book called?
The Journalist and the Murderer?
Well, it's I think it's actually in her book on Sylvia Plath, The Silent Woman, in which that she praises somebody. Is it Jennifer Rose? Is she the psychoanalytic
Jacqueline,
critic?
yeah.
Jacqueline Rose. And that, she praises her, Malcolm does, that she's just this brilliant interviewee who gives only a certain amount of herself, that she knows exactly how much she wants to reveal. And then there's this tiny moment at the end of the interview between Malcolm and Rose, in which Rose gets upset about something and the mask completely drops. It's a wonderful moment in which, that Malcolm's lifelong subject was the relationship, of course, between the cat and mouse of the interview and the interviewee. And so I guess for me, that my fatal flaw or tragic mistake is that when I enter the interview, like I want it to be an actual conversation, I sort of tell myself, just follow your talking points, your 3x5 cards, have your 6 points that you're trying to make about that book. But I always get bored by that after about 30 seconds. And I'm like, can we please have a conversation here? So I don't want to think of the interviewer as some archetype. I want to, I sound like Ahab trying to break through the mask or something. Like, I want to have an actual conversation that interests me. I just am very aware that we'll all be dead soon. And so, like, I want to have an actual conversation seems to be my mode, which is both productive, but also scary, I think.
Yeah, it's treacherous.
Exactly, treacherous is a good word, yeah.
Yeah, the moment where the mistake, it becomes the determining, thing will define you for the rest of your career.
Exactly.
Okay. Gosh, this sounds so vulnerable. Was vulnerability a consideration in your art making, or is vulnerability necessarily an act in art making?
I would say the last. That is, for better or worse, my MO. Basically, I began as a novelist and I wrote 3 novels in my 20s and 30s. And then I, in my late 30s, early 40s, became a writer of personal essay and book-length essay and literary collage. And, I really take seriously what Philip Lopate says about the essay form, which is that the drama or the war or the narrative or the plot of an essay is indeed the war within oneself, as one faces more and more deeply sort of the monster within. That is the plot of the serious book-length essay. And so I guess for me, once I became no longer a fiction writer per se, the place I could and do go as a writer of essay is that I try to scrape down as close to bone as I can. That's what the plot is of the work that I do. And so I think probably some people find it too much information, and some people find it a bridge built across the abyss of human loneliness, just depending on your taste.
Okay. But you know, I mean, the book, I mean, one could say it's also a very aggressive book, or your career has been a continuing series of aggressions against the literary establishment and against certain things like the novel. And even in this book, I mean, you take quite some potshots at certain revered figures like Marilyn Robinson. And so, I mean, do you ever worry? I have this idea that whatever amount of aggression one puts out into the world invariably comes back and, you know, hits you in the face. So does that also make you vulnerable, the degree to which you yourself have been kind of an aggressor too?
I mean, that does go to that particular line I read from, the whole thing about stuttering. I think there's a strange way. What did I say? What's the line? Stutterers often get away with certain rudenesses, certain violations they wouldn't have gotten away with if they didn't stutter. I don't think that's true, but I do think because I couldn't talk very much at all till I was around 30, you know, and I still have, you know, I still stutter sometimes, that it puts to me immense pressure on saying what I really think on the page. Like, I just don't want to waste this chance to speak. And I think there is something violently seizing about stuttering, and there's a desire, I don't know if it builds up in writers who stutter, you know, a kind of desire to shout or shriek or, you know, transgress, to violate. You know, there's something very humiliating about stuttering, especially when one is an adolescent. It's just so emasculating. It just is. And it's overwhelmingly a boy's problem, you know, rather than girls. There are some stutterers who are women, but overwhelmingly it's male. And I think there's some complicated mix that I'm figuring out between stuttering and the aggression of my literary angle. I mean, there's something going on there that I'm still figuring out.
Well, you know, I was noticing when you were reading from that chapter that your reading is much more gentle than the experience of reading those questions on the page, which is much more hammering and staccato. And I suppose that's true of your persona in person, is a much more benign kind of version of than you on the page, which is, I think, more hammering.
People often say that, like, really, you're this guy who wrote Reality Hunger or whatever, you just seem like a pussycat. And there's some weird split in me between a kind of whatever harmless self-presentation and holding on to all of my arrows for the page. That somehow that dialectic works for me in some complicated way.
Somebody asks if this is a sequel to Reality Hunger. Do you believe it is?
I think the book says that, and I think it is, in the sense that it is a remix of found quotations that earlier on in an earlier draft of the book, the questions were closer to the original questions. And also it has 22 chapters, the way Reality Hunger has 26 chapters, and it takes these quotes and remixes them even more aggressively than the quotes do in Reality Hunger. And so there's this, and also that there's an attempt to articulate a whole literary aesthetic in the book too. So, you know, it's stretching a point slightly, but I think there is a way in which it does talk back a little bit, I think, to Reality Hunger. Far more so than I think Trouble with Men. I think chronologically and narratively, it sort of picks up some threads from Trouble with Men, but I think of it as probably closer to How Literature Saved My Life and perhaps Reality Hunger.
Here are two questions about stand-up. Who's your favorite stand-up comedian? One Ted Gare asks, and then Dawn Dorland asks, regarding your comments on stand-up, how do you approach the form as individual jokes and or something holistic, shaped Question mark. Just curious to hear you elaborate on this mode as you both appreciate it in comics and compose your own literary form of it.
Interesting. And please jump in, Laura, if you have thoughts, because you thought heavily about this as well.
We're going to talk about Dave Chappelle. No, go on.
No, I could. I mean, I think when I think of like the key moment for me in stand-up, I mean, it's sort of an easy answer because everybody idolizes him, but the moment at the end, I think it's at the end of Richard Pryor's live at the Sunset Strip, that he had been, he almost had died freebasing. And at the very end of the set, Pryor asked somebody if he has a match. And so somebody comes up and brings them a match. Do you know the moment, Laura, or not?
I don't remember. I mean, I remember the.
And so everyone is yelling at him, don't burn yourself, Rich, and stuff like that. And so Pryor lights the match and then quotes a joke that had been going around. And he says, I hope I'm not going to wreck the joke, but he says something like, "What is this?" And then I think the punchline is just something like Richard Pryor running, because the match is burning. And then Pryor then really aggressively says, "I know that joke has been going around, that you all love me now, but you guys were having so much fun with me." Again, I'm not a stand-up comedian, obviously, but the way Pryor takes it and takes his own pain, he was a cocaine addict and he, had deep suicidal ideation and, had this horrific childhood, et cetera, et cetera. And the way that he owns the moment and takes comedy and takes his own pain and flips it into sort of shared universal feeling is just utterly transcendent and completely joyful. And it all happens in about 45 seconds. I mean, that's to me this paradigmatic moment of something that's very funny, incredibly visual, and, both a mixture of unbelievable comedy because people are just roaring, but he's also taking his own pain and flipping it first into just sort of delicious comedy, and then flipping it into sort of shared human woe. It's just utterly beautiful. I also was thinking of this line by, remember this critic at the Village Voice? What's her name? Laura Miller? Do I have her name right?
Well, Laura Miller is still writing criticism for Salon.
Right.
Yeah.
And she or not, Laurie Stone. That's who it was.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And she came to
she writes about stand-up.
Yeah. And she wrote a lot about in The Voice for people like Sandra Bernard and Spalding Grant and people like that. And I showed a movie I did in 2019 about Marshawn Lynch, who doesn't talk to the sports media, but who uses silence as a form of cultural resistance. And Laurie had such a great take on it, where she said he's exactly like a downtown performance artist of the 70s and 80s, in which she said, never show, she said, never show, never ask for forgiveness, never ask for love. And there was a third thing. And she thought that Marshawn Lynch embodied that perfectly. Never explain, never ask for forgiveness, and never ask for love. And I thought those were really powerful stand-up performance art stances. And I feel like, I'm not sure those are my stances, but they're relatively close to how this book works. It doesn't explain, doesn't apologize, and it doesn't beg for love. The love has to be earned somehow. I'm not sure how well that answers people's questions, but I was thinking of that wonderful Laurie Stone line that I think speaks to you and my interest in stand-up.
I would add never ask for permission. But
that's the words, right.
There's one, I guess, last question we could end on. If you answer it quickly, I think we're kind of out of time, but Chris Jeffries wants to know, has writing this book changed your view of Q&A sessions, such as this one we're having right now? That's a good meta question to
I
end.
know. It's like I did a thing for the Times on, by the book, and like I answered the questions very straightforwardly, and they wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to muck up the form. So it's sort of weird that I guess it would be kind of a tedious thing where if I turn every interview such as this into this meta thing. And I thought I would do that, but I haven't stayed true to my performance art mantra. So, finally it's a book, it's a performance, it's a somewhat sort of fictional thing. But anyway, thank you, Laura, for doing this. I hope that we can
It's
talk
fun,
about
David.
your book next time.
Good. This was a lot of fun. Thank you for asking me.
This was a blast. Thank you both so much for this conversation. David, Laura, this was a pleasure. Those of you at home, thank you for your very thoughtful, engaging questions. We hope you'll consider purchasing a copy of the very last interview from Community Bookstore. And we hope to see you at another virtual event very soon. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.